Welcome back to the Chess Geek channel. Hopefully you guys are all doing good as always. Today we are continuing the Caro-Kann masterclass. We are looking at the two knights variation, which follows after e4, c6, knight c3, d5, and knight to f3. White basically brings out both of their knights and delays the typical d4 for a later time. Now, the beautiful thing about the way I've structured this masterclass is I've made this masterclass super consistent. And that becomes really clear, especially in this chapter here, because almost all of the ideas you would have already seen if you've been following along with the masterclass. Now, what do I mean? Well, I'm recommending to take here, and after knight takes, if you recall, the previous two chapters started from this exact position. We played knight f6. The only difference is that in the previous two chapters, instead of the knight on f3, they played d4. And so we had this exact position with that small difference, which is really meaningless and insignificant because there's no real difference between knight f3 and d4. At some point, white is probably going to play both of those moves. So whether they start with knight f3 and, for example, after something like this play d4, or whether in the previous two chapters, as I showed, they start with d4 and later play knight f3, there's not really a huge difference. So we really looked at the nature of these positions, the type of positions that result from this opening in the previous two chapters. I have lined up a couple of lines and variations just to kind of refresh your memory, and maybe if this is the first time that you're joining this masterclass, this will hopefully also get you started, although I do highly recommend checking out the previous two videos, which I will reference a lot in this video because the ideas are basically the same. So after knight to f6, white has a couple of options. They can take, or they can retreat the knight to g3. We can also observe the move knight to g5 and the move queen to e2. These are really the main options that they have. Now we're going to start by taking, this is the basically Tartakower variation, and this is the chapter 4 that we discussed. Again, we looked at this exact position in chapter 4, super in depth. The only difference is they started with d4, and later played knight f6. But that means that our setup on our end is basically identical because, again, there's no huge difference. Likely, as I mentioned, they're going to play d4 either, right now, or, potentially they can start with c3 and later go d4, but d4 is a move white has to play to grab some space in the center. Otherwise, we're just going to be much happier. So more or less, this is going to transpose, but as a quick reminder, the basic setup we're going for is bishop d6, castles, bring the rook to e8 to free out this f8 square so that the maneuver knight d7, knight f8, knight g6 becomes possible. This light square bishop here, I like to bring it to g4 to try to encourage the move h3 to later drop it to e6, and then we can use this h3 pawn as a hook. We can sacrifice our bishop on that pawn with the queen supporting, and we get a massive attack. So I breezed through this idea very quickly, but again, that's just because in the previous two chapters, I delved really deeply looking at some concrete lines of this sacrifice. So if you're interested, that's what I'm recommending. You can certainly research this a bit further by looking at those videos I made. So that's really what happens if they take. We transpose like that. Now knight g3, we transpose again, this time to the previous chapter I made, where we looked at the idea of going h5, h4, h3. So if this is new to you, I recommend looking at that video, ramming the pawn up here to grab a significant amount of space to try to wreck and disturb the pawn structure and general piece coordination on the king side for white, and in general achieve some initiative from the get-go. So h5 here is my recommendation, and again, the only difference is this knight is on f3 instead of the pawn on d4. So likely that's going to transpose. For example, if they play d4 here, we basically transposed, we go h4, they have to move their knight, and we go h3. And once again, I delved very deeply into these sort of structures in the previous video, so this is where I'll leave it at for right now, but that's my recommendation, very consistent. Now, there are a couple of other options. The move knight to g5 is just as toothless as it was in the previous times that we saw this. It doesn't really carry a threat. We go h6, they can never go for knight takes f7. The knight here instead of d4 does not allow for extra tactical ideas, and giving away a piece in this position is certainly unjustified. So they're not going to go for this. Likely they're going to retreat to a3, but then that really calls into question whether this whole maneuver was worth it, right? The knight on h3 is certainly not better than it would have been on g3, so this is definitely a very dubious way for white to play. Nonetheless, we have a couple of options to try to play against it. They are relatively similar to what we've already seen. First of all, notice the two knights on a forkable square, so g5 is a very tempting option, totally legit. If you want to play like this, that's completely fine. You can develop the bishop by fianchettoing it later. Of course, g4 is a threat, very very pleasant position. Alternatively, if you want, you can also give away your bishop. I think, intuitively, I would probably stay away from this. I think giving them the two bishop advantage in such an opening position does definitely carry some risks. But then again, this pawn structure here is completely an issue. And if you can generate some quick play by moves of queen to d7 or queen to d5, or just develop, and if you can try to generate some attack quickly, then this way to play of giving away the bishop can also be a completely viable strategy. So that's kind of how you face this move, knight eg5. And the final thing I'll mention is queen e2. Now, queen e2 is a little bit better this time. This is probably the only move that makes a bit more sense in this variation with the two knights as opposed to the d4 variation that we previously looked at. The reason for this is if the pawn is on d4, well, we can just take it. As I showed very happily in the previous video, we're up a pawn and we have a very beautiful position. Here, we don't have that pawn that we can take, so it is a bit better for white to play queen to e2 here, but still taking out the queen so early does come with its own risks, and this isn't such a scary way to play. First of all, do not fall into this. This is really the only real trick or trap that white is trying to set up, of course, going for this mating idea. So don't fall and play knight d7. Instead, I recommend to simply take here the knight. And the point is, after queen takes, now we go knight d7. We are trying to replace this previous knight on f6 with this new knight that is coming over. There is one other tricky idea for them, which is after knight f6 to play knight to d5, knight to e5, threatening checkmate. So don't be persuaded by this queen. That will unfortunately lead to game over with bishop takes f7. So you have to be a bit more patient here. The move e6 is a very solid way to play, though, because after this, we're attacking their queen. Their queen has to retreat. And yes, our bishop is blocked, but they've made numerous moves with this queen. And so we've, solidified our position. And after a move like bishop d6 and castles, we can continue queen to c7, adding some pressure in the center. Our knight can come to d5 at some point. If they were to ever take, notice, they allow our bishop now to be free. So they won't take, and they'll play, for example, bishop d2, continuing to develop. But, we can worry about this bishop in other ways, right? So we can go, for example, b5, putting a question to this bishop, and after bishop d3, we can go a5. And you'll notice that we grab some space, we maneuver our pieces. This is relatively pleasant for us because in this position, we have a variety of ways to go about really getting this bishop developed usefully. We can put the bishop on a6 and go for expansions on the queen side with the move b4. We can expand in the center with e5 and then place this bishop, somewhere on this juicy diagonal. So there's a plethora of ways for us to deal with our developmental issues, and we have, in the meantime, much more space and potential in this position. So this is not scary. For example, b4 is already possible, and c5, and again, we want our bishop to develop like this, or by going e5, they can take, we take, and we're completely happy here, right? Opening up the d file certainly is not bad for us. We can again develop the bishop and then even occupy this d file. So there you have it. Hopefully this was a nice refresher and reminder for some of the previous ideas and concepts that I've highlighted on this Caro-Kann masterclass. We have very similar ideas, so hopefully you're going to be able to apply them whether they play the two knights or if they go for the main line by playing d4 instead. Thank you guys for watching. Subscribe if you are new around here. Like this video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.